And the first person that I'd like to welcome on stage is Mr. Boris Veldhuijzen van Zanten, serial entrepreneur, I would say one of the godfathers of the Dutch technology ecosystem and founder of the Next Web. So welcome, Boris. Boris, welcome. It's fantastic to have you with us today. How are you?
I'm fine, and it's a delight to be here. This all looks very professional, very different from the first conferences that I hosted, so I'm very proud of the work you're doing. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. The first conferences that we hosted, I recall a moment where we used to have a meeting a few years ago when you said, when is going to TNW be a real company, with a big slide on the screen that said, when are we going to be a real company? Is it a real company now?
Yeah, it's definitely a real company, and it's been for a few years. But I liked asking the question over and over again, because I think everybody has sort of an imposter syndrome effect, where you're like, I'm doing this, but is this like the right thing? And so it's good to ask yourself every now and then, like, yes, I think we're doing the right thing, right? This does look professional. People do consider us a real company. And on the other hand, it's also nice to not act like a professional company, to keep making jokes, to keep doing stuff that might seem amateur at first, but then is actually nice and revolutionary. So yeah, I like throwing the wrench into the machine and sort of sabotage things around. I sabotaged something today. You'll find out later. No, I didn't. But yeah, I like to keep things sort of personal and small. Yeah.
That's definitely part of the culture that you've brought to the company, right? And that made it what it is today, in the way that you've incorporated this feeling through everything that you do.
Yeah.
As we're here today to talk about sustainability and hackathon, I wanted to ask you, like, some memories that you would have around organizing hackathons over the years.
Yes, yeah. So I organized a whole bunch of them, and actually they're some of my favorite events. And the reason for that is that it's so inspiring to walk into a room and there are a bunch of people and you don't really know what's going to happen. There's no set agenda, and then you sort of just hope for the best. And then over the years you become more confident that that will work out. But that's very different from like a usual conference, where you have an agenda and everything is very sort of fixed and set, and you have your speakers and they're well prepared. But this is just put a bunch of inspired, ambitious people together and see what happens. And then the result is always amazing, right? So always at a hackathon, at the end, I'm just like, how is it possible that just a small group of people in one weekend build something that is so cool and interesting, where once you start getting a bigger company, like, you never do anything in 2 days, right? Everything always takes meetings and planning, and then like going to a hackathon every now and then sort of opens your mind to how simple things actually can be if you just have a few really motivated people together. Yeah.
Best memory that you have from one of the hackathon, or someone that you met through one of those events that you thought, if it hadn't been for this, we probably would have never built that, or I've never met that person?
Yeah, so I remember being at a hackathon, and I was talking to a developer, and he just seemed so vague, like just like a weirdo, really. But I also liked him, and he had this concept. I don't even remember really what it was, and he had trouble finding a partner at the event. But then at the end of the day, he found someone, and they're like, "Oh, I found another guy. He was also a weirdo," and they started building something. And at the end of the conference, it was sort of interesting and promising, but not yet finished. Which, makes sense because it was just a hackathon. But then, like a year later, it turned out they turned into a real company, and then they rented space in our spaces where we rent space to startups. And at one point they sold the company as well. And it was just very thrilling to see sort of the whole story from conception to like a successful company being sold. And I've had a few of those, and that's just more delightful than reading a book or watching a movie, and it plays out over a longer time. It's just such a thrill. Yeah.
I can imagine, and it's great to see that it does happen, right, for all the participants as well. Like, hackathons are not just a fun couple of day weekend to work on. It can actually lead to real companies, lead to real change, and I think that's why we're here today.
Absolutely.
That's fantastic. And I think now you're going to be telling us a little bit more about stories, war stories, you know, your journey, some of the things that you've built, and specific anecdotes. Really excited for that. So, thank you so much. Then we'll hear from you in a second.
Thank you. So the story I am going to tell you today is one of the startups that I've built. So I'm currently the founder and a board member of TNW, and that's a company I sold to the Financial Times almost 2 years ago, I think. But before that, I started and sold a few other companies. Now, most of the companies I started failed miserably, but a few of them were quite successful. So you could say I'm a serial entrepreneur. And the funny thing about the serial entrepreneur is that like it's a term not everybody knows, and I don't often use it, but I was at a conference a few years ago in the US, and a guy I knew introduced me to another entrepreneur. And he said to the other entrepreneur, this is Boris, he's a serial entrepreneur. And then the other guy said, oh, I'm Mark, I'm a successful serial entrepreneur. And I was sort of, well, all right, that's a lofty thing to say about yourself, and that's not how I would ever introduce myself. But he saw my discomfort, and he said, well, it's an important distinction to make, because there are a lot of entrepreneurs that start companies all the time, and they all fail, and then, of course, they're also a serial entrepreneur. But if you're successful at something, then you might as well claim it. And I said, well, I still feel uncomfortable claiming that. But there's a quote from Winston Churchill, and it says, success is going from failure to failure without a lack of enthusiasm. And so in that sense, I feel very successful, because I had a lot of failures. And to me, sometimes the definition of building a company, running a company, is sort of shoveling shit and going from problem to a crisis in a row, and hoping for the best. There is, however, one company that I'm extremely proud of, and it's not a company that's very well known, but I wanted to tell you that story, sort of to inspire you for this hackathon on how to build things. And the story starts with Twitter. So when Twitter was just a year old, they had less than 1 million users. My Twitter handle is just Boris, so I was early at Twitter. And in the beginning, there were no statistics for Twitter. And I was at an event I had organized myself, and I spoke to someone, and they said, oh, I read the next web. And I said, oh, are you subscribed to the newsletter or something? And he said, no, I follow you on Twitter. And so I said to my business partner, like, oh, do we have a Twitter account for our blog? And then my business partner said, yeah, and it's got a lot of followers as well, and I think it's growing as well. And so we looked at the number, and we're like, oh, wow, we've got like 1,000 followers, which was amazing at the time. But we couldn't see like how the number grew over time. And I said to my partner, like, I guess we could build something to get like the number every day and store it in a database, and then show it to other people as well. And then we could generate like an image with the number, so people could put like an image with the number of followers they have on their homepage, which was a popular thing at the time. And then if they click on it, they can see their statistics and follow them. And I was sort of thinking about this out loud. And my business partner, who's a great developer, he said like, yeah, I guess we could do that. And I said, and I got more excited. So I said like, well, you could build that like maybe in a few weeks, because it's not like super complicated. And he said, well, I could. And I guess it's funny, but you know, we have bigger fish to fry, and it's not really a priority. And the thing I heard in his answer was, it's funny. And there's a quote by an author, I forgot, but like a famous scientist, and the quote is, the great breakthroughs in science are never met with a eureka. Nobody invents something and go like, oh, eureka, the light bulb. And he says, actually, what the thing you hear is somebody saying, hey, that's funny. And the story has a basis in that the scientist had like a big room, bigger than this, and there were all kinds of scientists doing experiments. And he says, there's never one that says eureka. But sometimes I see a small group of them huddle together and laugh about something, and then I'll walk over and I say, hey, what's going on? And then one of them will say, well, we were doing this experiment, we were combining A plus B, we expected C, but then, hey, that's funny. We got a totally unexpected result. And he said, those are usually sort of the starts of like a great breakthrough. So when my business partner said, that's funny, I'm like, hey, wait a minute, that's a cool thing, right? If it's funny, then it's probably interesting to more people, so I should build it. So I tried to persuade him, but he's like, nah, I don't want to do it, other things to do. And so, with a few drinks, after a few drinks at the end of the event, I went home, and in the middle of the night, I opened my computer, and I'm not a good developer at all, but I know how to Google. So I Googled, how do you generate an image with a number in it in PHP, like the popular coding language at the time. And I found a small library, some code that I could adjust. And after about an hour, I had an image with a number in it. It was ugly and it was slow, but like the most difficult part of the thing I envisioned, I sort of fixed in an hour. So I'm like, oh, that's actually interesting. So then I built like a graph and like a start page kind of thing, and I coded the whole night. And the next day, I didn't go to the office and coded some more. And 3 days later, I went to the office, and I showed it to my partners. I had an image which looked kind of cool with like the amount of followers you have on Twitter. And you could click it, and I go to a statistics page, and it would show the statistics. And I built like a spider, so I got the information from the mobile side of Twitter and get the number extract the number from the site and put it in a database. So I had all the basics. And what I didn't have, however, was a login system for users. So how the system worked was that you went to the Twitter statistics website, and then you would see my statistics. So it showed my username and my statistics. And if you wanted to see your own statistics, you would have to manually enter your Twitter handle, click reload or something, and then it would show your statistics, but only from that day because I couldn't go back in time. So it was a very rudimentary, like basic system, but it sort of worked. So I showed it to my partners, and they said, so what's your plan? And I was like, well, I don't really have a plan, but I thought I'll just code on it for a few more weeks and then maybe launch it in a few months and see if people like it. So I worked on it for another week, and then one night I said, oh, screw it, let's just launch it as it is. And so without a login system and sort of this weird front page that showed my statistic, I launched the service. And because I didn't like have a designer, I just copied the whole Twitter site and registered a domain name Twitter counter.com, which was, of course, in violation of copyright law and brand stuff and everything, but I didn't really care about it because it was just a hobby project. So I launched it, and then I think a few bigger blogs wrote about it because it was a cute and funny little thing, and everybody started using it. And a week later, I got an email from Twitter, and they said, listen, you clearly copied our whole site, and you're using our brand name, and that's just not something we can accept. I'm like, oh, I totally understand. And then I said, well, I don't really have time to change it, so what can you do for me so it makes sense for me to, this was reverse psychology, but so I sort of blackmailed them into mentioning my statistics service on twitter.com. And then like in an hour, I changed the design slightly, I got a new logo in, but I kept the Twitter counter name. So I got even more traffic. And a weird side effect of all the traffic, because I had no login system because I'm a lousy developer, was that everybody saw my statistics and my name and figured like, who is this Boris guy? And they clicked to my Twitter accounts and then like, I'll follow Boris. I don't know who Boris is, but maybe he's funny. And so my follower numbers started shooting up because I was featured on the front page of Twitter counter. And then a few weeks later, a funny thing happened where somebody said to me, like, hey, I see that you're featured on the front page of Twitter counter. Can you make me the featured user on Twitter counter? So I said, like, well, sure, how much are you offering? And then he said, I'll pay you $50 a week. So I'm like, yeah, cool. So I put this other person on the front page of Twitter Counter, and then I tweeted, and I said, I just sold the front page of Twitter Counter to somebody else as a featured user. And then 3 other people said, oh, I'll take a week for $50. So I walked over to my partners, and I said, I have great news. We're cash flow positive, because the hosting costs were $50 a month, and I had just sold $200 worth of featured user accounts on the front page of Twitter Counter. And then I said, but the bad news is that we're sold out, so this is not a scalable model. And then my business partner said, well, if you change instead of charging per week, you can charge per amount of views, and if you get more traffic, you make more money. So that's an easy fix for that. So I changed it. And then suddenly we had a business model. And the interesting thing there is that I didn't really come up with this, right? I just built like a flimsy basic service, and then by opening it up to the world, my clients actually suggested this business model. Now the funny thing about the business model is that as the service grew, we started making more money, and at one point we were doing like $50,000 a month in traffic for featured users. And then one day, because the whole payment system, I hacked that together as well. It wasn't really secure. So my business partner said, all right, I'll step in and fix make it more secure and scalable. And then he changed the site. So I was selling like packages for 100,000 views for €250 or something like that. And so we had like the €250 package and the $500 package. And then the next day I logged in, and my business partner had added a $25,000 package. And I'm like, why would you do that? Nobody's going to buy that. And then he said, well, I read a book that if you include like a really expensive option, then the level below that suddenly looks cheap. So I'm like, all right, that's actually funny. And it's funny to have like such an expensive package on the site for like 1 million views or something. And then the next week, we sold 3 of those packages. And it turned out there was like a fight between West Coast rappers in the US and East Coast rappers. And they all wanted to have the most followers, and they had all the money in the world. So they just started buying the $25,000 packages at Twitter Counter. So the whole company was like an amazing, weird experiment that actually did really well. And for years funded, we self-funded TNW from the revenue of Twitter Counter, which was just a flimsy project I started in a week. Now, the reason I want to tell you this story is that a lot of companies seem to have like a business plan and a planning and a roadmap and a strategy and their values and everything written out, and it seems like they have their shit together, and then you're just starting on your project and you're like, oh, I don't know anything, I just have this little thing. But actually, if you look at company, like most of the time, it starts really simple. And then if you have an open mind and sort of trust your luck or serendipity, then great things can come from small projects. And I think that, to me, that's the highlight of a hackathon, that you have a bunch of people starting with small stuff. But if the simplest version of an idea makes people smile and sort of gives you energy, and you're like, oh, that sounds so much fun, then the rest will usually follow. And it's still a shit show, and you'll run into like 1,000 problems, but it's going to be a fun run. So enjoy your hackathon.
Amazing. Boris, please. Thank you so much, Boris, for this. It's been such a great story, actually, and I have to say, after 5 years that we've known each other, I've never learned this one. I've never heard this one before.
I keep some stories in the back.
Exactly. There's always more stories when you think you already shared a lot of them. I think it's fantastic. I was discussing a couple of weeks ago the idea of the pursuit of scrappiness with different people, and I think it fits really nicely with what you were discussing.
That's a beautiful concept. Yeah, I love that. Yeah.
It's amazing. I would like to discuss a couple of other things, right? Because obviously with all of those scrappy ideas being pursued, and God knows how many have been tested at the Next Web, like over the years and through some of the other companies that you've built, like what are some of the moments where you thought, we did this we tried, we fucked up, it didn't work out.
Yeah.
We could have probably done it in a million other ways. Like, what are some of those, like, let's say, most famous quote unquote fuck ups that you've worked on?
All right, I'll tell you one example. So first of all, I was at a conference a few years ago, and they said we want to talk about your biggest digital blunder. And then I said, well, do you want to hear my daily blunder, the weekly or the monthly, or the because like everything, just you try so much, and I'm really in favor of like the scrappy, just try something, see what makes people laugh, where people say like, oh, I like this part, and then sort of follow, instead of conceptualizing and working on it for a long time. And with TNW, I think one funny example where was in New York. So we had a conference in New York, and New York is an interesting town. Like I think 1/3 of all companies fail within like the first 3 years, and that means that it really doesn't pay off to invest in long-term relationships with other companies. So we had a conference there, and if we did a conference in Amsterdam, then we would work with a partner and we say, well, we want to organize a conference, we want to work with you over years, and it's like a long term and there's trust. In New York, it's very different. And I remember like one example of that was we had a conference, and like a few days before the conference, they suddenly said, hey, do you want the power sockets to work? And we're like, duh, yeah, of course. And they're like, right, it's going to be $20,000 extra. And we're like, no. And they said, you want to cancel the event? And we're like, no, we need the power sockets to work. And they're like, all right, that's 20,000. And that was very typical for New York. Like they just try to sort of screw you over on every occasion. And so after 3 years, we're just like, all right, screw this. We're just not going to have a conference again in New York. So I think that's one of those examples where, like, before you do it, you're just like, well, how hard can it be, right? We just organize a conference. And then you find out that there are so many like subtle cultural differences, and it's really like more difficult than you think. So I think that's something that's underestimated about businesses. There's a story about Google that I always found very inspiring. So Google on the outside seems like two guys invented something and it went straight up and success and billions, right? That's sort of the outside story. But if you talk to the founders, they say that in the first 10 years, there were 15 moments where there was an existential crisis where the evening before, they didn't know if they would still have a company the next day. So just like make or break decisions for the whole company. And I found that inspiring and sort of found some relief in that, because I think everybody who runs a company has the same experience. Like, it's never easy, right? Every month, every day, there's a new challenge where you're like, all right, this is new. With all the experience I have, this is new. So, I mean, that's also the fun part, but I don't think people realize that when they look at companies.
Yeah. That's great. I think it's also really valuable for all the people attending the hackathon today to realize that it's going to be a bit of a roller coaster weekend. It's going to be a roller coaster journey if they take those ideas and those companies forward from this weekend in the future, and that they're not alone, right?
Yeah.
Everybody is facing the same challenges, and there's obviously a lot of roadblocks along the way.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that, Boris. Really appreciate your time and inspiring all of those people and participants and teams today. We will now be moving to a short break, and we will be back here at 10:40 for a panel going live from Romania. So really excited.